Yeah.
So great. So the next verse, I'm not going to read it because it's too long. It's just to give context, but again, people will have these slides. You can go back and read it for yourself.
Yeah.
We'll just go to these last couple ones to round this off. And mention Lot when he said to his people, do you commit iniquity, fahisha, with eyes wide open? Do you indeed come with desire unto men instead of women? Nay, but you are a people behaving foolishly. Okay, so again, very specific what the problem is with their behavior.
Yeah.
And then in another, again, so that was in Surah An-Naml, now Surah Al-Ankabut, and mention Lot when he said to his people, you commit iniquity, the same word, fahisha, such as none in creation have committed before you. Do you indeed come unto men and cut off the road and practice evil deeds in your assembly? So here we get two other things, the sort of highway robbery and then other types of unspecified evil deeds that they practice in their assemblies, which scholars have speculated on, right? So here are some other sins, but we saw in all these other cases, it's like very specifically, the same-sex nature of their act. The reply of his people was but to say, bring upon us God's punishment if you are among the truthful. So they're quite haughty and sort of, not very concerned that this might bring on God's punishment, as if they're challenging him. And when our messengers, and I just mentioned the angels, came to Lot, he was anguished on their account and constrained from helping them. And he said, this is a trying day. And his people came hastening unto him. And before that, they had been working evil deeds. Lot said, O my people, these are my daughters. They are purer for you. So fear God and disgrace me not with respect to my guests. Is there not among you a right-minded man? They said, you know well that we have no claim on your daughters. And indeed, you know what we want, i.e. your male guests. Now, this is one of the, verses that the revisionists will point to say, okay, well, look, this is the rape, this is the implied rape scene. And you say, but wait a minute, but Lot's response is, these are my daughters, right? They're purer for you, right? So these are men, here are my daughters are women. What's the difference between the guests and the daughters? It's their gender. And if you assume that these men want to rape the guests, it's not reasonable to think Lot is saying, well, oh, don't rape my guests because that's inhospitable, but rape my daughters instead,
Doesn't make any sense.
Right? I mean, if that were the case, so why is he not blaming them for wanting to rape? Why would he say, take my daughters instead? And then he says, they're purer for you. And you don't say, well, don't rape somebody because it's not pure to rape someone. Like, just have consensual sex because it's more pure. Like that's not how anyone talks. I mean, when he says they're purer for you because you're men and they're women, and that's a pure act, right? Not this act with these men. It's like super clear, but again, leave it up to academics to kind of complicate. Right? And so anyway, reinterpreting this as rape, right, is a classic example of anachronistically projecting contemporary notions onto the texts, such as this post-sexual revolution fixation on consent as the only relevant criterion. It's so obvious. I mean, people are saying, well, wait a minute, it must be that there's a lack of consent here, because that's the only thing that makes sense to us. That's the only crime that we could imagine, is that there was just a lack of consent, and therefore it must have been rape, because don't we all know that consent is really what matters when it comes to sexual behavior? And I mean, it's just obviously just, taking like literally the last 3 decades kind of, sexual measuring stick for sexual morality and just projecting it thousands of years into the past and reading it into a text where it clearly has nothing to do with it. But
yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. John Boswell, the American Harvard professor, who wrote the classic revisionist work from a Christian point of view on this story in the Bible in the 80s, I think. I mean, he sadly died of AIDS himself subsequently, but he proposed that it was to do with rape and so on. But his work was then, as indeed is often the case, was critically assessed by biblical scholars and was found to be very wanting. And indeed, the top experts now in the biblical field accept that this passage, the Sodom and Gomorrah passage, the Lot passage, and others do speak of homosexual acts, actually, even though these scholars themselves don't agree with the Bible. And I think Professor John Barton, who I've had the immense privilege of speaking to on my channel, professor of Bible at Oxford University, one of the world's leading biblical scholars of the Old Testament, he has said this to me. He said, no, the revisionist argument that it's about rape, it's not really, is completely wrong. It's not based on the Hebrew text. It's eisegesis rather than exegesis. Mm-hmm. But Professor John Barton, don't agree with the Bible anyway. Right. I mean, so you know, and this, and in fact, the world's preeminent scholar in this field is not John Barton. It's a specialist in this area. I forget the scholar's name. He's written the scholarly text is usually seen as the defining. Clearly states the revisionist case has failed, and the traditional understanding is correct. But this very author himself doesn't agree with the Bible, because they're very liberal, or they view the Bible as purely a human construct, like John Barton very publicly does. So, you know, the traditional reading is the correct one, but many Christians simply don't accept it anyway. They'll say, well, we don't agree with that. We have our own views. We're modern people. We accept the LGBT agenda. So that's a remarkable irony that the traditional reading actually wins at the end of the day, but people still disregard it anyway.
You know what I'd say, Paul? At least be honest. You know, they're being honest. They're saying, well, here's what the text says. We can't make it say what it doesn't say implausibly. We might have wished it to say something different, but it doesn't. And we don't agree with, okay, we're not going to follow it, but okay. But don't try to like play games with what it actually says. And this idea of like, we can just read into it anything we want, or
that's not plausible. I mean, I know advocates say this, you hear this on social media and so on, that serious scholarship doesn't go along with that. But serious scholarship, the individuals who write that will actually accept the gay agenda anyway, because they are modern, enlightened Western people. And part of the liberal academy.
They're not committed to the Bible.
They will accept that publicly. They will say, oh, no, we support all these agendas, even though the Bible, correctly understood in its historical context, is actually speaking of these acts. Yes, they were prohibited then. But today, as John Barton said to me, we live in a different world, and therefore we can accept these acts.
Right.
That's what he argued.
Yeah.